Maria Santos never imagined that her nursing skills would one day make her a war hero. Growing up in a small farming town in Texas, she spent her childhood helping her mother care for injured animals and sick neighbors. Her gentle hands and calm nature made everyone trust her completely. When she turned 18, Maria decided to become a nurse, despite her family's concerns about the dangerous world beyond their peaceful town. The year was 1943, and World War II was raging across Europe and the Pacific. Young men from Maria's town were leaving every week to fight overseas, and many never returned. The local newspaper was filled with stories of battles, victories, and losses. Maria felt a strong pull to help somehow, but she wasn't sure how a simple farm girl could make a difference in such a massive conflict. After completing her nursing training at the regional hospital, Maria heard about a new program that was recruiting nurses for military service. The Army needed skilled medical personnel to help wounded soldiers closer to the front lines. This was extremely dangerous work, as military hospitals were often targets for enemy attacks. Many families tried to discourage their daughters from volunteering, but Maria felt this was her calling. The recruitment officer, Lieutenant Johnson, was impressed by Maria's test scores and her calm demeanor during the interview. He explained that she would be stationed at field hospitals just behind the main battle zones. The work would be exhausting, scary, and sometimes heartbreaking. Soldiers would arrive with terrible injuries, and not all of them could be saved. Maria listened carefully to every word, but her determination never wavered. During her military training, Maria learned how to work under extreme pressure. She practiced treating gunshot wounds, burns, and broken bones while sirens blared and instructors shouted commands. The other nurse trainees came from all over the country, and they quickly became like sisters. They supported each other through the difficult training and shared stories about why they had volunteered for such dangerous duty. Maria's instructor, Sergeant Williams, noticed her exceptional ability to stay calm during chaotic situations. While other trainees sometimes panicked when faced with mock emergency scenarios, Maria moved with steady confidence. She had an unusual talent for making quick decisions under pressure, and she never seemed to lose her focus, even when everything around her was falling apart. The day finally came when Maria and her fellow nurses received their overseas assignments. She was being sent to the European theater, specifically to support the Allied forces pushing through Italy. The journey across the Atlantic Ocean took 2 weeks on a crowded military transport ship. Many soldiers and nurses became seasick during storms, but Maria spent her time learning more about battlefield medicine from the ship's medical officer. When they finally reached the Italian coast, Maria got her first real look at the war. The port city had been heavily bombed, with destroyed buildings and rubble everywhere. Local civilians looked tired and hungry, and Maria realized how much the war had affected innocent people. She felt both scared and determined as she stepped off the ship with her medical supplies and personal belongings. The field hospital where Maria was assigned sat in a valley about 5 miles behind the current front lines. It consisted of several large tents connected by wooden walkways, with a constant stream of ambulances bringing wounded soldiers from the battlefield. The head nurse, Captain Morrison, gave Maria a quick tour and explained the hospital's procedures. Everything moved at an incredibly fast pace, with new patients arriving every few minutes. Maria's first patient was a young soldier from Ohio who had been shot in the shoulder. As she cleaned and bandaged his wound, he told her about his family back home and how scared he was about returning to battle. Maria listened carefully while she worked, offering gentle words of encouragement. She realized that emotional healing was just as important as physical treatment for these brave young men. During her first week at the field hospital, Maria worked 12-hour shifts every day. She quickly earned the respect of her fellow nurses and the medical officers because of her skill and tireless dedication. Even when she was exhausted, she never complained or showed impatience with difficult patients. The wounded soldiers began asking specifically for Nurse Maria because she made them feel safe and cared for. The hospital's location meant they could hear artillery fire and explosions throughout the day and night. Sometimes enemy planes would fly overhead, causing everyone to take cover in the reinforced bunkers. During these frightening moments, Maria would stay with patients who were too injured to move, holding their hands and speaking softly to keep them calm. Her bravery during these attacks did not go unnoticed by her supervisors. One evening, Captain Morrison called Maria into her office for a private conversation. She explained that the Army was planning a major offensive operation that would require medical personnel to move even closer to the active combat zone. They needed their most skilled and courageous nurses for this dangerous assignment, and Maria's name was at the top of the list. This would mean leaving the relative safety of the current hospital and working in conditions where enemy fire was a constant threat. Maria accepted the assignment without hesitation. She understood the risks, but she also knew that wounded soldiers would need immediate medical attention that could save their lives. The offensive was scheduled to begin in 2 weeks, which gave her time to prepare mentally and physically for what lay ahead. She wrote letters to her family back in Texas, though she couldn't tell them exactly where she was going or what she would be doing. As the date for the offensive approached, Maria noticed increased activity around the base. More soldiers were arriving every day, and there were constant meetings between officers planning the operation. She spent her final days at the field hospital training with the other nurses who had volunteered for the forward assignment. They practiced setting up medical stations quickly and treating patients under simulated combat conditions. The night before they were scheduled to move out, Maria couldn't sleep. She lay in her cot listening to the distant sounds of artillery and thinking about the soldiers who would soon be risking their lives in battle. She had no idea that in just a few days, her quick thinking and brave actions would save the life of one of the Army's most important generals, forever changing the course of her own life and earning her a place in military history. The morning of the offensive arrived with dark clouds covering the sky and a cold wind blowing across the Italian countryside. Maria and 5 other nurses loaded their medical supplies into military jeeps and prepared to follow the advancing troops. Their destination was a small town called Monteverde, which intelligence reports indicated would be captured within the first day of fighting. The plan was to establish a forward medical station in the town's old school building once it was secured. General Robert Harrison, the commanding officer of the entire operation, had specifically requested that the medical team move up quickly behind his forces. At 52 years old, Harrison was known throughout the Army as a brilliant strategist who cared deeply about his soldiers' welfare. He had earned the nickname the Shield because his careful planning always minimized casualties while achieving military objectives. His presence at Monteverde would be crucial for coordinating the next phase of the offensive. As their convoy moved toward the front lines, Maria could see columns of tanks and trucks filled with soldiers heading in the same direction. The sound of artillery grew louder with each mile, and occasionally they would pass ambulances heading back toward the main hospital with wounded soldiers. Maria felt her heart racing, but she focused on reviewing her medical procedures and checking her supplies one more time. The capture of Monteverde took longer than expected. Enemy resistance was stronger than anticipated, and the fighting continued well into the afternoon. Maria and her team waited at a checkpoint about 2 miles from the town, listening to radio reports about the battle's progress. Finally, around 4 o'clock, they received word that the town was secure, and they could proceed to establish their medical station. Monteverde looked like many other Italian towns that had been touched by war. Several buildings showed damage from artillery shells, and debris littered the narrow streets. However, the old school building that would serve as their medical station was still intact. Maria and her team worked quickly to set up treatment areas, organize supplies, and prepare for the wounded soldiers who would soon begin arriving. General Harrison arrived in Monteverde just as the medical station became operational. He wanted to personally inspect the forward positions and meet with his unit commanders to plan the next day's advance. Maria noticed him immediately because of the way other soldiers snapped to attention when he walked past. He was a tall man, with graying hair and intense eyes that seemed to take in every detail around him. The general spent about an hour meeting with his officers in a building across the street from the medical station. Maria was busy treating a soldier with a minor leg wound when she heard the distinctive whistle of incoming artillery shells. Enemy forces had apparently repositioned some of their guns and were now targeting the town center. She quickly helped her patient take cover as explosions began rocking the area. The first few shells landed near the edge of town, but each successive round came closer to the center where the medical station and command post were located. Maria, realized that the enemy gunners were systematically adjusting their aim, trying to destroy the important buildings where American forces had established their headquarters. This was a common tactic that she had heard about but never experienced firsthand. During a brief pause in the shelling, Maria looked out the window and saw General Harrison emerge from the command post building. He was apparently trying to reach his radio operator in a jeep parked nearby, probably to call for counter-battery fire against the enemy guns. As he ran across the street, Maria heard the whistle of another incoming shell that sounded much closer than the previous ones. The shell landed directly in front of the building where General Harrison had been meeting with his officers. The explosion was tremendous, shattering windows throughout the area and sending debris flying in all directions. Maria saw the general thrown to the ground by the blast, clearly injured and unable to move. Smoke and dust filled the air, making it difficult to see exactly what had happened. Without thinking about her own safety, Maria grabbed her medical bag and ran toward the spot where the general had fallen. She could hear more shells whistling overhead, indicating that the enemy bombardment was continuing. Other soldiers were also trying to reach their injured commander, but they were taking cover behind buildings and vehicles because of the ongoing artillery fire. When Maria reached General Harrison, she could see that he was conscious but badly hurt. Blood was flowing from a deep gash on his forehead and his left leg appeared to be broken. More seriously, he seemed to be having trouble breathing, which suggested possible internal injuries from the blast. Maria quickly assessed his condition while trying to shield him from flying debris as more shells exploded nearby. The general tried to speak, probably wanting to give orders to his men, but Maria gently placed her hand on his chest and told him to stay quiet. She could see that he was going into shock, which was extremely dangerous given his other injuries. Her training had taught her that shock could kill a patient faster than wounds that looked much worse. She needed to stabilize his condition immediately. Working under the most dangerous circumstances she had ever faced, Maria used her medical supplies to stop the bleeding from the general's head wound and stabilize his broken leg. She gave him an injection to help with the pain and shock, then carefully checked for signs of internal bleeding. All around them, shells continued to explode and soldiers were shouting orders, but Maria blocked out everything except her patient. Several soldiers finally reached their position and wanted to immediately carry the general to safety, but Maria insisted that he needed more treatment before he could be moved. She explained that moving him too quickly could worsen his internal injuries and potentially kill him. The soldiers were nervous about staying in such an exposed position, but they trusted the nurse's judgment and provided cover while she continued working. After about 10 minutes of intensive treatment, Maria determined that General Harrison was stable enough for transport. She had managed to control his bleeding, treat his shock, and immobilize his broken leg. More importantly, her careful examination had revealed that his breathing difficulties were caused by a bruised rib cage rather than serious internal damage. This meant he would likely survive if he received proper treatment at the main hospital. The journey back to the field hospital took nearly an hour because they had to travel slowly to avoid worsening the general's injuries. Maria rode in the ambulance with him, constantly monitoring his vital signs and adjusting his treatment as needed. She noticed that despite his pain and injuries, General Harrison remained alert and concerned about his soldiers who were still fighting in Monteverde. When they finally reached the field hospital, the head surgeon immediately took charge of General Harrison's care. Maria provided a detailed report of his injuries and the treatment she had given him under fire. The surgeon praised her quick thinking and professional skills, saying that her immediate treatment had probably saved the general's life. Without her intervention, he would likely have died from shock and blood loss before reaching the hospital. News of Maria's heroic action spread quickly throughout the military hospital and beyond. Word reached headquarters that Nurse Santos had risked her life under heavy enemy fire to save General Harrison, one of the Army's most valuable commanders. Officers who had served with the general for years spoke of how his strategic brilliance had saved countless American lives, making Maria's rescue even more significant for the overall war effort. General Harrison spent 3 days in the intensive care unit before his condition stabilized enough for him to receive visitors. His first request was to speak with the nurse who had saved his life. Maria was initially hesitant to visit such a high-ranking officer, but Captain Morrison insisted that she go. When she entered his room, The general was sitting up in bed with his leg in a cast and bandages around his head. The conversation between Maria and General Harrison lasted nearly an hour. He wanted to know everything about her background, her training, and what had motivated her to run into danger to help him. Maria spoke honestly about growing up on a farm in Texas and her desire to help wounded soldiers. The general listened intently, occasionally asking questions about her family and her experiences since arriving in Italy. What impressed General Harrison most was Maria's matter-of-fact attitude about what she had done. She didn't see herself as a hero, just a nurse doing her job under difficult circumstances. When he tried to thank her for saving his life, she simply said that any of the other nurses would have done the same thing. This humility, combined with her obvious courage and skill, convinced the general that Maria deserved special recognition. After Maria left his room, General Harrison immediately called for his aide and began dictating a letter to Army headquarters in Washington. He described the events at Monteverde in detail, emphasizing how Maria had risked her life to provide life-saving medical care under direct enemy fire. He specifically requested that she be considered for the highest military honor available to non-combat personnel, explaining that her actions had demonstrated extraordinary valor. The letter reached Washington just as military leaders were looking for positive stories to share with the American public. The war had been dragging on for years and civilian morale needed boosting. The story of a young nurse from Texas who had saved a general's life was exactly the kind of inspiring tale that newspapers and radio stations would embrace. However, the military bureaucracy moved slowly, and Maria heard nothing about any potential recognition. Meanwhile, Maria returned to her regular duties at the Forward Medical Station, which had been relocated to a safer position several miles behind the new front lines. She continued working her usual 12-hour shifts, treating wounded soldiers and helping other nurses with difficult cases. Her colleagues noticed that she seemed different after the incident with General Harrison, more confident and focused than before. The other nurses began treating Maria with a new level of respect, not because of her actions during the artillery attack, but because of how she had handled the attention afterward. Many people would have become boastful or demanded special treatment, but Maria remained exactly the same person she had always been. She still helped with the most unpleasant tasks and never complained about long hours or difficult conditions. About 2 weeks after the Monteverde incident, a jeep arrived at the medical station carrying a colonel from Army headquarters. Colonel Peterson had traveled all the way from Rome to personally interview Maria and other witnesses about what had happened during the artillery bombardment. He spent the entire day gathering detailed statements and taking photographs of the medical station and surrounding area. Colonel Peterson's interview with Maria lasted several hours. He asked her to describe exactly what she had seen, heard, and done during the attack. Maria answered every question honestly, though she continued to downplay her own role in the events. The colonel was particularly interested in her decision-making, process under fire, and her medical assessment of General Harrison's injuries. He took extensive notes throughout their conversation. The colonel also interviewed the soldiers who had witnessed Maria's rescue of General Harrison. Each man told the same basic story. The nurse had run directly into danger without hesitation, provided expert medical care under enemy fire, and refused to leave her patient until he was stable enough for transport. Several soldiers mentioned that her calm presence had helped keep everyone else focused during the chaotic situation. After completing his investigation, Colonel Peterson informed Maria that her actions were being reviewed at the highest levels of military command. He couldn't provide specific details about what might happen next, but he assured her that her courage had not gone unnoticed. Maria thanked him politely but didn't allow herself to hope for anything beyond the satisfaction of knowing she had done her job well. General Harrison recovered more quickly than his doctors had expected. Within a month he was back on limited duty, though he still walked with a slight limp from his broken leg. His first official act upon returning to command was to write a second letter to Washington, this time providing additional details about Maria's character and qualifications. He had spent weeks thinking about her actions and had become even more convinced that she deserved extraordinary recognition. The general also made it his personal mission to learn more about Maria's family background and her life before the war. Through military records and inquiries with her previous supervisors, he discovered that she had consistently demonstrated the same qualities of courage, selflessness, and professional excellence throughout her career. This pattern of behavior made her actions at Monteverde seem less like a single moment of heroism and more like the natural expression of her character. During his recovery, General Harrison had time to reflect on how close he had come to death and what that would have meant for the soldiers under his command. The offensive operation at Monteverde had been crucial for the overall Allied strategy in Italy, and his death or serious incapacitation could have jeopardized the entire mission. Maria's quick actions had potentially saved not just his life, but the lives of countless other soldiers who would have been affected by a failed operation. Word of Maria's story began spreading beyond official military channels. Soldiers wrote letters home describing the brave nurse who had saved their general, and these stories were shared in small towns across America. Newspapers in Texas picked up the story and began running articles about their local hero serving overseas. Maria's family received visits from reporters and neighbors who wanted to know more about the young woman who had become famous. The growing publicity made Maria somewhat uncomfortable. She had never sought attention or recognition for her work, and she worried that the focus on her individual actions might overshadow the contributions of other nurses and medical personnel who were equally dedicated and brave. Captain Morrison assured her that the positive attention was good for the entire nursing corps and would help people back home understand the important role that women were playing in the war effort. As winter approached, Maria received word that she was being transferred back to a base hospital in England for what was described as special assignment. She assumed this meant she would be working with more seriously wounded patients who required extended treatment. The transfer orders came directly from Army headquarters in Washington, which was unusual for a nurse of her rank, but Maria didn't question the decision. The journey from Italy to England gave Maria time to think about her experiences over the past several months. She had seen terrible things and witnessed incredible acts of courage by ordinary people faced with extraordinary circumstances. The war had changed her in ways she was still trying to understand, making her more confident in her abilities while also more aware of how precious and fragile life could be. When Maria arrived at the base hospital in England, she was surprised to find that her special assignment was not what she had expected. Instead of reporting directly to the medical wards, she was instructed to report to the administrative offices where a major was waiting to speak with her. Major Williams, a kind-faced woman in her 40s, explained that Maria had been selected for a very unusual honor. The major revealed that Maria's actions at Monteverde had attracted attention from the very highest levels of government. President Franklin D. Roosevelt himself had read the reports about her heroic rescue of General Harrison and had personally approved her for the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military decoration. Maria sat in stunned silence as the major explained that she would be the first woman to receive this honor for actions performed during World War II. Maria's first reaction was to insist that she didn't deserve such recognition. She explained that she had simply done what any trained nurse would do in the same situation, and that many other medical personnel had performed equally brave acts without receiving such attention. Major Williams listened patiently to Maria's concerns, then gently explained that the Medal of Honor was not just about individual achievement, but about inspiring others and recognizing the contributions of all women serving in the military. Durkin, Major went on to explain that the medal ceremony would take place in Washington, D.C., where President Roosevelt would personally present the award. This meant that Maria would need to travel back to the United States, something she had not expected to do until the war was over. She would also be required to participate in several publicity events designed to boost morale on the home front and encourage other women to contribute to the war effort. Maria asked if she could refuse the honor and simply continue her nursing duties, but Major Williams explained that this was not really an option. The decision had been made at the highest levels of government, and refusing would be seen as unpatriotic and disrespectful to the president. However, the major assured her that she would be able to return to overseas duty after the ceremony if she wished, and that her service record would not be affected in any way. The news of Maria's impending Medal of Honor presentation created a sensation in the American press. Newspapers across the country ran front-page stories about the humble farm girl from Texas who had saved a general's life under enemy fire. Radio stations interviewed her family members and former neighbors, all of whom expressed pride in Maria's achievements while emphasizing her modest and selfless character. Back in Texas, Maria's hometown of Cedar Creek was preparing for a celebration, unlike anything in its history. The mayor declared a special Maria Santos Day and began planning a parade and ceremony to honor their local hero when she returned home. Local businesses donated money for decorations and refreshments, and schools organized special programs to teach children about Maria's courage and service. Maria's parents received hundreds of letters from strangers expressing admiration for their daughter and gratitude for her service. Many of these letters came from families who had lost sons in the war, and they found comfort in knowing that people like Maria were working to save as many soldiers as possible. Her mother, Rosa Santos, kept every letter in a special box and read them whenever she felt worried about Maria's safety. The journey back to the United States took several days by military transport ship. During the voyage, Maria had time to think about what her life would be like after receiving the Medal of Honor. She worried that the fame would change how people treated her and make it difficult to return to her normal nursing duties. She also wondered if other nurses would resent the attention she was receiving when they had all made similar sacrifices. When the ship docked in New York Harbor, Maria was amazed to see a crowd of reporters and photographers waiting on the pier. Military officials had arranged for her to be escorted through the crowd without having to answer questions, but she could hear people shouting her name and asking about her experiences overseas. The scene was overwhelming for someone who had spent months in the relative quiet of military hospitals. The train journey from New York to Washington gave Maria her first real glimpse of how the war had affected the American home front. She saw women working in factories that had previously employed only men, and noticed that many public buildings displayed honor rolls listing local men serving overseas. The reality of the war's impact on ordinary Americans made her realize why her story had resonated with so many people. In Washington, Maria was housed in a guest facility near the White House while preparations were made for the medal ceremony. She was assigned a military escort, Lieutenant Sarah Johnson, who helped her navigate the complex schedule of meetings and interviews that had been arranged. Lieutenant Johnson, who was about Maria's age, became a friend and confidant during the stressful days leading up to the ceremony. Maria's first meeting with military officials in Washington was both intimidating and inspiring. She was introduced to several generals and colonels who had read detailed reports about her actions at Monteverde. Each of them expressed personal gratitude for what she had done, and several mentioned that they had served with General Harrison at various times during their careers. They spoke of him as not just an excellent commander, but as a man who truly cared about the welfare of his soldiers. The officials also briefed Maria on the significance of the Medal of Honor and the responsibilities that came with receiving it. They explained that she would be expected to make public appearances and speeches to help maintain morale and support for the war effort. While this was not legally required, it was considered part of her patriotic duty as a Medal of Honor recipient. Maria agreed to these responsibilities, though she remained nervous about speaking in public. During her time in Washington, Maria was also introduced to several other Medal of Honor recipients who shared their experiences with her. These men, all of whom had received the medal for combat actions, welcomed her warmly and assured her that she belonged among their ranks. They explained that the medal was not about seeking glory, but about recognizing moments when ordinary people did extraordinary things to help others. One of these veterans, Sergeant Frank Morrison, had received his Medal of Honor for actions in the Pacific Theater. He spent an evening with Maria discussing how the recognition had affected his life and offering advice about handling the public attention. Sergeant Morrison emphasized that the most important thing was to remember that the medal represented not just her individual actions, but the sacrifices of all the people who served alongside her. The day before the medal ceremony, Maria had a private meeting with President Roosevelt himself. The president, who was confined to a wheelchair due to polio, received her in the Oval Office where they spoke for nearly 30 minutes. Maria was struck by his warmth and genuine interest in her story, as well as his deep knowledge of the military situation overseas. He asked detailed questions about conditions in the field hospitals and the morale of the soldiers she had treated. President Roosevelt explained to Maria that her Medal of Honor was particularly significant because it represented the expanding role of women in the military and in American society generally. He spoke about how the war was changing traditional ideas about what women could accomplish and how her example would inspire other women to take on challenging roles in service of their country. Maria listened thoughtfully, beginning to understand the broader significance of what was happening. The president also shared his personal thoughts about General Harrison, whom he had known for many years. He described the general as one of the Army's most valuable leaders, whose strategic insights and care for his soldiers had saved countless American lives throughout the war. President Roosevelt emphasized that by saving General Harrison's life, Maria had potentially affected the outcome of numerous future military operations, making her actions even more significant than she had realized. As Maria prepared for bed, the night before the ceremony, she reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought her from a small Texas farm to the nation's capital. She thought about all the wounded soldiers she had treated, her fellow nurses who continued to serve overseas, and the responsibility she would carry as a Medal of Honor recipient. Despite her nervousness about the ceremony, she felt honored to represent all the women who were contributing to the war effort in their own courageous ways. The morning of the Medal of Honor ceremony dawned bright and clear in Washington, D.C. Maria woke early in her guest quarters, feeling a mixture of excitement and nervousness that she had never experienced before. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, but nothing could have truly prepared her for the reality of receiving the nation's highest military honor from the President of the United States. Lieutenant Johnson helped Maria dress in her formal military uniform, which had been specially tailored for the occasion. The crisp fabric and polished buttons made her feel more official than she ever had during her months of service overseas. As she looked at herself in the mirror, Maria could hardly believe that the young woman staring back at her was about to make history as one of the few women to receive the Medal of Honor. The ceremony was scheduled to take place in the Rose Garden of the White House, where a small group of military officials, government dignitaries, and members of the press had been invited to witness the historic event. Maria's parents had traveled from Texas for the occasion, and she was deeply moved to see them waiting proudly in the front row when she arrived at the ceremony site. As Maria took her place before the assembled crowd, she noticed several familiar faces among the attendees. General Harrison, who had recovered sufficiently from his injuries to attend the ceremony, stood with other high-ranking military officers. He smiled and nodded at Maria when their eyes met, and she could see the genuine gratitude and respect in his expression. His presence made the moment even more meaningful for her. President Roosevelt was wheeled into the garden precisely at the scheduled time, and the ceremony began with the playing of the national anthem. Maria stood at attention with tears in her eyes as the familiar melody reminded her of all the soldiers who had died fighting for their country. She thought about the wounded men she had treated, many of whom would never return home to hear that song played at peacetime celebrations. The president's aide read the official citation describing Maria's actions at Monteverde, detailing how she had risked her life under heavy enemy artillery fire to provide life-saving medical treatment to General Harrison. The formal language of the citation made her actions sound even more dramatic than Maria remembered them being, but she understood that the ceremony was about more than just her individual story. When President Roosevelt began speaking about Maria's courage and dedication, his words carried the weight of a leader who understood the true cost of war. He spoke about the thousands of women who were serving their country in various capacities, often far from home and under dangerous conditions. He emphasized that Maria's Medal of Honor represented not just her own achievements, but the contributions of all the women who were helping to win the war. The president described Maria as an example of the American spirit at its finest, someone who had answered her country's call to service without seeking recognition or reward. He spoke about her humble background and her natural compassion for others, qualities that had led her to choose nursing as a profession and later to volunteer for dangerous military duty overseas. His words painted a picture of Maria as a true American hero. As President Roosevelt prepared to place the Medal of Honor around Maria's neck, he paused to speak directly to her. He thanked her personally for her service and told her that the entire nation was proud of her courage and dedication. The president's words were simple but heartfelt, and Maria felt overwhelmed by the honor of receiving such recognition from the leader of the free world. The moment when the medal was placed around her neck was one that Maria would remember for the rest of her life. The weight of the medal felt significant, not just physically but symbolically, representing the trust that her country had placed in her and the responsibility she now carried as a Medal of Honor recipient. The small crowd applauded enthusiastically, and photographers captured the historic moment for newspapers across the nation. After the formal presentation, Maria was given an opportunity to address the crowd. She had prepared remarks beforehand, but standing before such a distinguished audience, she decided to speak from her heart instead. She thanked the president and the military officials for the honor, but emphasized that she had simply done what any dedicated nurse would have done in the same situation. Maria used her speaking opportunity to pay tribute to all the medical personnel who were serving overseas, particularly the nurses and doctors who worked tirelessly to save lives under the most difficult conditions. She mentioned her colleagues by name and described their dedication and skill, making it clear that she was accepting the medal on behalf of all of them. Her humility and grace impressed everyone present, including the seasoned politicians and military leaders who had attended many such ceremonies. The reception following the medal ceremony gave Maria a chance to meet personally with many of the attendees. Government officials, military leaders, and members of the press all wanted to speak with her and learn more about her experiences overseas. Maria handled each conversation with the same quiet dignity she had shown throughout the ceremony, answering questions thoughtfully while continuing to emphasize the contributions of others. General Harrison approached Maria during the reception and had an emotional conversation with her about what her actions had meant to him personally. He explained that he had spent months thinking about that day at Monteverde and had come to realize that her quick thinking and medical skills had not only saved his life, but had allowed him to continue leading soldiers who depended on him. The general's gratitude was deeply moving, and Maria finally began to understand the full significance of what she had done. The media attention following the ceremony was intense but generally positive. Newspapers across the country ran front-page stories about Maria's Medal of Honor presentation, and radio stations broadcast interviews and commentary about her achievement. The coverage emphasized her humble background and selfless character, portraying her as an ideal example of American womanhood during wartime. Maria found the attention somewhat overwhelming, but recognized its importance for morale on the home front. During her time in Washington, Maria also met with officials from the War Department who discussed her future service options. They offered her several different assignments, including the opportunity to remain in the United States and help with recruitment and training of medical personnel. However, Maria made it clear that she wanted to return to overseas duty as soon as possible, feeling that her fellow nurses needed her support and that wounded soldiers required her skills. The officials were initially reluctant to send a Medal of Honor recipient back into danger, arguing that she had already done more than enough for her country. However, Maria's determination and the endorsement of General Harrison eventually convinced them to approve her request for overseas reassignment. They agreed that her return to active duty would send a powerful message about dedication to service and would boost morale among medical personnel serving.